This video has been heavily edited to avoid being age restricted due to the topics presented. Viewer discretion is advised. Now turn off the lights, sit back, and enjoy. And above all else, thank you for watching. Fear is a fundamental and complex emotion that has evolved over millions of years to help humans respond to threats and dangers in their environment. It is a powerful and adaptive emotion that can trigger a wide range of physical, emotional, and cognitive responses. From an evolutionary standpoint, fear has been a crucial means for human survival. It has served as a mechanism to alert individuals to potential threats and prepare them for a flight or fight response. This instinctual reaction is deeply ingrained in our biology, as it helped our ancestors avoid predators and other dangers. Unfortunately, in the cases I am presenting today, fear was not enough to avoid death. Fear primarily involves the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep inside our brains. When the brain perceives a threat, the amygdala sends signals that activate the sympathetic nervous system, leading to increased heart rate, shallow breathing, and heightened alertness. There are many types of fears: learned fears from an individual's life experiences, phobias, anxiety disorders, and innate fears. That last one, innate fears, are especially relevant for the topic today: survival. Innate fears, such as the fear of loud noises or heights, appear to be hardwired into our biology. These innate fears likely developed over the course of human evolution as protective mechanisms. Innate fears also include an apprehension of dark spaces, or a heightened anxiety when you hear a noise that you can't identify. These fears can help us avoid threats and stay alive, or they can warp reality and lead to our demise. Fear can distort thinking, and when in a state of fear, people tend to focus on the perceived threat and may have difficulty thinking logically or rationally. This can lead to irrational beliefs and behaviors, especially when the level of fear is higher than the individual can cope with. As viewers of terror, either on film or in reality, typically we're separated from horrific events by decades of time or perhaps thousands of miles of geographic distance. It's much easier for us to make rational judgments and pretend that we would have had a much higher chance of survival if we were in that situation. However, most people actually in these situations would be overwhelmed by fear and likely become just another one of the victims of the horror that's soon to come. 1906, La Crosse, Wisconsin. Edward Theodore Gein was born into an abusive family situation. He was born to George Gein and Augusta Lurkey, both of whom played a role in Edward's abuse. His father was an alcoholic, while his mother was fanatically religious, often reading passages from the Bible about death and the wages of sin to Ed and his brother Henry. His mother took out her own victimhood on Edward by becoming sadistic and verbally abusive herself. Despite the abuse from his mother, Edward idolized her. His respect turned into an obsession, and his obsession with his mother would be a pattern for his formative years, leading to his fetishizing of women, and then much, much worse. That awful childhood might explain Edward's life thereafter, but it cannot possibly excuse the horror that Edward would eventually cause. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving him, his brother Henry, and his mother as the remaining members of the Gein family. Then in 1944, Ed's brother Henry died in mysterious circumstances during a fire near the family's farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Although Ed reported his brother missing to the police, he was able to lead them directly to the burned body when they arrived. And despite bruises discovered on the victim's head, the death was ruled an accident. In retrospect, it's probable that Henry was one of Ed Gein's first murders. Then in 1945, the death of Gein's mother left him a virtual hermit. Unable to maintain steady employment, likely due to his strange mannerisms and bizarre interactions with others, Gein had to live on his family's abandoned farm. Gein cordoned off the areas of the house that his mother had used most frequently, preserving them as something of a shrine. Gein attracted the attention of the police in 1957 when a hardware store owner named Bernice Warden went missing. Gein had been seen with her shortly before her disappearance, and when law enforcement officials visited the farm, a horror beyond human comprehension was discovered. Authorities found the, remains of Bernice Warden in Gein's farmhouse. She had been fatally shot, hopefully beforehand, and parts of her body were separated from her torso, including her head. And despite how disturbing that murder was, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Gein had been robbing graves and creating bizarre items from human remains for years. He had systematically exhumed and collected the recently deceased and crafted household items, clothing, various preserved organs for display, and masks from their remains. One of the more shocking discoveries was the quote-unquote woman suit that was made from the skin of his female victims, which he used as a macabre costume. There's a lot more, but for the sake of this video and my low tolerance for gore, I'm gonna stop there. If you want to know more about the Butcher of Plainfield, there's many videos specifically about him, but holy shit, we're moving on. 2 murders were immediately and directly attributed to Gein. The first was the killing of tavern owner Mary Hogan, and the second was the murder of Bernice Warden. Unfortunately, the remainder of the remains were in such a state that identification was extremely time-consuming, and in some cases impossible. Gein's MO involved shooting or strangling his victims before, going full Home Depot on their corpses. Gein was arrested and subsequently confessed to the murders of Warden and Hogan, though he claimed to have no memory of the actual killings. He was deemed mentally unfit for trial and committed to a mental institution. Ed Gein died in that mental ward in 1984. His twisted legacy has continued to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts, serving as a chilling reminder of the darkest corners of the human psyche. His crimes and psychological profile have left an indelible mark on American culture. His story has been the inspiration for numerous films, books, and television series. Ed Gein, now known as the Butcher of Plainfield, was the monster who became the inspiration for iconic fictional figures such as Norman Bates, Hannibal Lecter, Barbie, and the subject of today's video, Leatherface. This is the story of 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Come on, Franklin. It's gonna be a fun trip.
1973, Newt, Texas. Strange things have been happening around the small community of Newt, Texas, in the northern part of the state. Famed radio host John Henry Falk is going over the day's news from around the country. A shooting in some big city, a crime spree on the West Coast, nothing out of the ordinary. And then his reporting takes a dark turn. Reports of grave robbing in North Texas. Obviously, the families of the deceased were concerned and angry. He continues to describe reports of unspeakable things being done with the remains that the authorities have been able to recover. Falk leaves out any further details than that. Perhaps the reports are unsubstantiated. Perhaps the facts on the ground are too intense and gory for public consumption via the radio. What we would soon discover turned out to be so much worse than what was being reported. Families of the deceased flocked to the country cemetery to check on their loved ones. Were the corpses of their family members one of the ones that were desecrated? A small group of young adults pulled up to the cemetery in a van. Inside were 5 people: Kirk, Pam, Jerry, Sally, and Franklin. Sally and Franklin are siblings, and their grandfather was buried in that cemetery. The rest of the occupants were friends or lovers along for the ride. It's unclear whether checking on their grandfather's grave was the main point of their trip, or if it was just an excuse to have a bit of fun on a long road trip together. The locals are strange but helpful and give off a vibe of darkness, giving us a creepy feeling that should have served as a warning not to proceed any further. Franklin is wheelchair bound and has difficulty socializing with others on top of his physical disability. He's very talkative, especially about subjects that are a bit dark and awkward. He's also the only one on this trip without a romantic partner. Sally and Jerry are a couple, as are Kirk and Pam. So already there is a feeling that Franklin is a bit of a fifth wheel. I'm pointing this out because not only is he one of the most annoying characters in cinematic history, but he's also right most of the time. He is fearful and timid, but if the group had listened to his warnings, they may have survived. In a bit of foreshadowing, Pam is reading her horoscope mumbo-jumbo, which predicts danger and suffering for most of them. After a very brief visit to the cemetery, the gang continues to look for an abandoned property in the area, once owned by Franklin and Sally's family. Along the way, they see a hitchhiker walking alongside the road. In true 1970s stupidity, they pull over and give him a ride. It was abundantly clear that their guest was some sort of ghoulish tweaker. Instead of kicking him out of their van immediately, they let him ride and try to engage in conversation. Their conversation starts weird and gets darker and more gruesome the more they converse, eventually leading to a discussion about the finer points of how to properly kill cattle in a slaughterhouse. Franklin, who's only slightly more socially acceptable than their new passenger, describes in graphic detail new advances in technology that allow slaughterhouse workers to put down cattle using a pneumatic gun, which has replaced the old ways. Their new passenger, Crackhead McGee, who is intimately familiar with the goings-on of the slaughterhouse, pines for the old ways, using a sledgehammer to manually and quite brutally bash the life out of cattle. Being such large animals, the sledgehammer method rarely worked on the first strike, so you had to bash them over and over again. Franklin thinks it's a good time to pull out his favorite knife and start playing with it. In a true stroke of genius, he allows Mr. Meth to play with it too, because sharing is caring, I guess. His new bestie starts to cut himself, because of course he does. Then he lunges at a wheelchair-bound Franklin and proceeds to badly cut him too. Finally, the gang kicks him out of the van, leaving him on the side of the road, but not before he smears blood on the side of the van, perhaps marking it. They continue their journey and keep looking for the family property where they hope to stay for the night. Not too long after that, they run low on fuel. This being 1970s North Texas, there's not much more than grass and fire ants to keep them company. They pull up into a tiny gas station hoping to fuel up their van and ask for directions. The station is in disrepair. There's no gas, and the attendant, who is another walking cautionary tale of the dangers of inbreeding, only speaks in grunts and doesn't seem to acknowledge their existence at all. An old man, the owner of the gas station, emerges to tell the group the bad news about the fuel situation. He also goes full horror movie harbinger trope and warns the crew that they shouldn't be looking for their property. It's been too long and it could be dangerous. Though one of the more articulate characters on this trip, he is clearly being evasive about the fuel situation and directions to the property. By the way, the old man also mentions that all he has in the store is barbecue.
No secret, it's the meat. Don't skimp on the meat. I got a real good eye for prime meat. Runs in the family.
Wait a minute.
Hey, you know where the old Franklin place is?
The old Franklin place?
Yeah, it's an old two-story rock house and it's sitting up on a hill. I think you have to turn on that road back there, but I'm not real sure. Oh, my father owns it.
And that's your daddy's place, huh?
Yeah.
Does this mean Franklin's name is actually Franklin Franklin? Despite the creepiness of the cemetery, the run-in with Cracky Chan, the warning from the gas station manager, and Franklin's apprehension, the gang continues to head towards the property. When they arrive, they find the abandoned farmhouse to be in shockingly poor condition. Suddenly, Pam and Kirk are stricken by horniness and want to go see the swimming hole. But, on the way to the hole, they hear the sound of a generator running. This means gasoline. Pam and Kirk follow the sound and find another house, slightly less dilapidated than the previous one. In the face of every warning that has already happened, in the face of common sense and basic human instinct, Kirk enters the house seeking someone to hook them up with some gas. The house is covered in signs of decay, haunting, dangerous. He slowly moves further into the house, towards a curious metal door, separating the front half of the house from the back. As he gets closer, the metal door slams open, and a giant of a man appears with a bloody apron and some sort of mask. A mask made out of human flesh. Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. By the way, he's wearing a tie, so he's already dressed nicer than me. With an insane amount of force, he brings down a small sledgehammer directly on Kirk's head, caving it in. Kirk is the first victim. His lifeless body slumps to the ground like a marionette whose strings have been cut. Leatherface drags Kirk's twitching body beyond the metal door and closes it. After a moment, Pam enters the house looking for Kirk. She takes a similar path through the house and finds a room that can only be described as a temple to death. Trinkets and decorations made of human remains, parts of possibly animal skins, bones, and feathers. Pam is seized in terror, unable to comprehend the horror she's witnessing. From outside her peripheral view, Leatherface appears and captures her, alive. She's taken beyond the metal door to a room covered in blood and adorned with knives of various sizes and purposes. Despite Pam screaming and struggling to free herself from Leatherface, he easily lifts up her body, then down on a hanging meat hook, which impales her through the back, dangling her above the ground, unable to escape, and still alive. In front of her, on a table, is what's left of Kirk's corpse, head misshapen by blunt force trauma. Leatherface pull starts a chainsaw and proceeds to butcher Kirk in front of Pam, as she is forced to watch in terror. Meanwhile, back at the van, Jerry is getting impatient, bored, or both. He wants to take Sally down to the swimming hole to join the fun. Sally, conflicted, decides she can't abandon Franklin, who can't make it down the path to the lake in his wheelchair. Jerry follows the same path and also ends up at Leatherface's house looking for Pam and Kirk. Here we see a great example of how director Tobe Hooper builds a sense of dread. Instead of using just gore, he uses shots like this. The slow movement of the camera gives us the sense that the person on screen is being watched, or worse, being followed. Jerry enters the home, slowly poking through the house of horrors. He makes it all the way to the kitchen, the butchering area of the house, beyond the metal door, which has been left open. As he witnesses the gruesome scene and evidence of murder, a pounding sound draws his attention to the deep freezer. After a bit of struggling, Jerry is able to break the lock and open the freezer. Inside is Pam's seemingly lifeless corpse, skin depleted of any color or signs of life. Pam bolts upright, barely alive, and desperately trying to escape. Jerry focuses on trying to process the events happening around him, allowing Leatherface to get the drop on him, and ends his life with the same sledgehammer. Jerry is Leatherface's second victim, and Pam is the third. Several hours pass, and the sun sets. Night has arrived. Fear, bordering on panic, is starting to set in. Franklin and Sally are still by the van, in the dark, waiting for someone, anyone, to return from their trip down to the lake. Two problems emerge. First, Jerry apparently took the keys to the van. Second, Sally has to decide to either leave Franklin by the van and look for her friends alone, or attempt to take Franklin with her through the trees and the brush. A decision is made, and Sally, pushing Franklin, enters the woods. Franklin's, not light. His weight pushes down on the wheelchair, digging the wheels into the soil, making it nearly impossible for Sally to push him. What was that? A noise. Out of the darkness, Leatherface appears and eviscerates Franklin with his chainsaw. Franklin is dead, and our national nightmare is over. He will be remembered as the most annoying character in a film until Newt in Aliens.
And they mostly come at night. Mostly.
Ironically, Franklin is the only person in this movie to be killed by a chainsaw. Sally gathers enough sense to run, but not knowing where to go, she's unable to escape, and this is where another horror trope was born. Due to her relative small size and superior speed, she could easily outrun a lumbering Leatherface. However, no matter how fast she runs, Leatherface is always right behind her. Supernaturally so. She eventually makes it back to the gas station, where she finds the owner again. It turns out that he's in cahoots with Leatherface. He tries to bind and blindfold her, but she resists. Sally grabs a large knife to defend herself. It is then that she is defeated by a much superior weapon. A broom. It was probably an assault broom, a true weapon of war that no civilian should possess. The old man captures her and takes her back to his house. The very same house that Pam, Kirk, and Jerry met their fate. Walking along the driveway is none other than the meth head man, who turns out to be the old man's son. The old man is clearly disappointed in his son's life choices, especially the fact that he started this series of events by tweaking in their van. The father's also quite upset at his other son, Leatherface. His two sons are reckless and could jeopardize the family's, meat processing operation. They take Sally to their dining room, which consists of furniture made from human remains. She is bound to a chair and witnesses what can only be described as the worst Thanksgiving dinner ever. Trust me, I know the feeling. Her dining experience is not 5 stars, and I suspect that she left a negative review on Yelp. True madness takes the place of any sort of human conversation. Not only are they planning to eat Sally and her friends, but it is implied that they might also do some other stuff. Just use your imagination and multiply by 100. Grandpa is brought downstairs to join the family for dinner. We actually have met him before, Sally did, but at that point he appeared to be just another one of the corpses. However, he appears to be alive, just barely, but showing some faint signs of life for someone of his advanced age. Grandpa apparently was a legend in the, meat processing sector. In his prime, he could take down a cow, and, assumedly other beings, with one masterful swing of the sledgehammer. Why is this movie not called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Anyway, I digest. Grandpa is clearly past his prime, and I'm not entirely sure he's alive. He is wheeled over to Sally to make the kill, but he can't even hold the sledgehammer. His body is articulated by the rest of the family like Weekend at Bernie's. After a few attempts, Sally is struck, but the swing is so feeble, she is only moderately damaged. She breaks free and jumps out a window and makes a run for it. At this point, the sun is now rising, and through a stroke of incredible luck, she makes it to a main road. Mephistopheles is right behind her, slashing her with a knife. However, he is having so much fun that he doesn't notice what is coming down the road at highway speeds. An 18-wheeler tenderizes him instantly, then purees his body under the tires. Okay, I'll stop with the food puns. The truck was driving by at just the right time. The driver attempts to help, but Leatherface is right behind them, chainsaw at full throttle. The truck driver does the most intelligent thing anyone has done in this movie, and runs. A pickup truck slows to see what the commotion's all about. Sally jumps into the bed of the truck, and they speed off. Leatherface, in a display of inbred rage, spins in the street, swinging his chainsaw around in the air, howling like an animal. Sally escapes, physically, but after all she's seen and experienced, she snaps, laughing, crying, and screaming as her mind folds in upon itself. Slasher horror films have had a long and storied history, evolving over the decades to become a significant subgenre within the broader realm of horror cinema. These films are characterized by their focus on a masked or mysterious killer who stalks and brutally murders a group of usually young and often sexually active victims. Go into the swimming hole. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not only a marker for what I call the golden age of slasher films, but as a film, it remains unmatched in the craft of horror movie making. For example, the soundtrack contains no sounds from musical instruments, with the exception of some music they had the rights to. Instead, Tobe Hooper, the director, used sounds an animal would hear or make inside a slaughterhouse. Metal on metal scraping, distant final screams of creatures in pain meeting their end, industrial noises of machines of death in operation. Surprisingly though, this film is one of the least bloody horror films that I can remember. This is because the director, Tobe Hooper, intended to make the movie for a PG rating by keeping the violence moderate, the language mild, shamefully excluding nudity entirely, and having most of the horror implied off screen, rather than shown in great detail on screen. This plan eventually backfired and made the film even more horrifying in my opinion. Despite cutting and repeated submissions, the ratings board insisted on giving it an X rating, and it wasn't until the film received an R rating when Hooper gave up and released it. The chainsaw is only seen cutting the flesh of one character on screen. It's at the very end, and it's the leg of Leatherface himself. Even Franklin's death was in shadow and off screen. The gore and blood was surprisingly minimal compared to other films in the genre. However, it's the atmosphere Hooper created, plus the deeply disturbing themes of cannibalism and implied forced victimization and necrophilia, that prevented Texas Chainsaw Massacre from getting a PG rating, clearly. Behind the scenes, the production of this movie was equally disturbing. Well, almost. In interviews, Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, recalled shooting the sequence where they cut Sally's finger and tried feeding the blood to Grandpa. The tube that was supposed to shoot out the fake blood kept clogging. And finally, after several takes without the tube working right, Hansen simply sliced Marilyn Burns' finger open. He explains, "At this point in the production of this movie, we were insane." He proceeded to explain that his only desire at that point in shooting was to get the film done. He didn't care about his fellow actors' well-being, and this sequence was shot in the back end of a 27-hour workday. Gunnar also noted in this interview that there isn't much acting going on in the dinner scene. The actors, exhausted and awash in gore and horror, snapped a little bit themselves. In the iconic scene at the end of the movie when Leatherface swings his chainsaw around in frustration because Sally gets away, Hansen was directed to look frustrated, and he knew stomping his feet in anger would not suffice. He changed it to swinging his chainsaw because he wanted to scare director Tobe Hooper as payback for the way he treated the cast during filming. Despite the madness it took to create, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remains a classic horror film and has, since release, become a cult classic. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a seminal work in the horror genre, known for its gritty and unsettling atmosphere, as well as its influence on subsequent horror films. It explored themes of rural isolation, brutality, and the breakdown of social norms, making it a lasting and iconic piece of horror cinema. I was gonna have a hamburger for dinner, but after this review, I think I'm gonna have a salad. Thank you to all of my subscribers for bearing with me on this adventure. If you enjoyed this video, you might need some therapy. But before you go to therapy, please click that thumbs up button so this video is shared with more people. If you want another spooky review, check out my video on 1973's The Exorcist. It's on screen now. Also, if you're feeling especially generous, you can support this channel financially by clicking the thanks button below this video. Thank you for watching.
Can